What happens when cold stops being just weather and turns into a physical predator consuming everything alive? How do you survive at -50 degrees when firewood costs more than gold by voluntarily burying yourself in freezing Canadian dirt instead of building a thick wooden house? The human instinct is to build sturdy walls, to stack heavy logs, to fight the approaching winter with roaring fires and proud architecture. But nature does not negotiate with architecture, and it certainly does not care about human pride. It is January 1898, and the Klondike Gold Rush has turned Dawson City into a frozen, unforgiving graveyard. The polar night has descended over the territory like a suffocating blanket, bringing temperatures so devastatingly low that steel tools shatter like glass against the ground, and a drawn breath burns the lungs like inhaled acid. Across the sprawling, chaotic settlement, thousands of desperate prospectors are slowly realizing that the fortunes they pulled from the riverbed cannot buy them another morning. They are burning their own furniture, tearing apart their wooden floorboards, and feeding absolutely everything they own into massive iron stoves that radiate heat for only a few feet before the killing draft steals it away. They are freezing to death inside expensive, heavily timbered cabins built by men who genuinely believed that wealth could conquer the Yukon. Yet, less than 2 miles away from this epicenter of suffering, one man is comfortably riding out the polar apocalypse entirely underground. He is burning nothing more than a handful of dry twigs a day, breathing warm air, and listening to the apocalyptic winds howl harmlessly above his ceiling. But how does a man surrounded by deadly permafrost become the warmest soul in the Klondike? The story of this impossible survival, of a man who outsmarted the deadliest winter in a decade, began 5 months earlier, in August 1897, when the fever of the gold rush was at its absolute, deafening peak. Arthur Vance arrived in Dawson City not with pockets full of money or dreams of instant wealth, but with a quiet, calculating understanding of how the physical world actually worked. The boomtown was a symphony of chaos, echoing with the relentless sound of hammering, the shouting of merchants, and the frantic energy of men racing to claim flat, buildable plots of land in the muddy center of the valley. Newly minted millionaires and desperate dreamers alike were paying astronomical, extortionate prices for imported timber, competing to build the largest, most imposing structures they could afford before the season turned. Arthur walked away from the noise, ignoring the prime real estate entirely. He wandered to the absolute edge of the settlement, finding a steep, rocky, unforgiving hillside that faced away from the prevailing winds. With a shovel and a heavy iron pickaxe, he simply started hacking into the ancient permafrost. He was not digging a mine shaft looking for a forgotten vein of gold. He was excavating a deep, dark, deliberate trench directly into the frozen, unyielding earth, preparing to build a home where no sane man would ever choose to live. Was it pure madness, or a calculated preparation for an invisible enemy no one else saw coming? In a frontier town where status and survival were universally measured by the size of your cabin, the thickness of your logs, and the height of your stone chimney, Arthur's behavior looked like pure, unadulterated lunacy. Caleb Ward, a wealthy syndicate man who had just finished erecting a massive 2-story log mansion dominating the main street, made it a regular habit to ride his horse past the hillside just to watch the pathetic spectacle. He had absolutely no idea that his beautiful wooden fortress would soon become a perfectly designed death trap. Ward and his hired master carpenter, a man named Silas Gibbs, would stand by the muddy wagon rut and openly laugh at the solitary figure violently attacking the dirt. Ward loudly declared to anyone who would listen that Arthur was simply saving the town the eventual trouble of digging him a proper grave for the impending winter. The carpenter would critically point out that placing timber against raw earth was an invitation to instant rot, predicting that the structure would collapse under its own wet weight long before the snow arrived. The joke caught on with vicious speed in the crowded saloons and trading posts. Before the first autumn frost even hardened the mud in the streets, the entire camp had crowned Arthur with a mocking nickname, universally referring to him as the Earthworm. They laughed at the poverty of his materials and the apparent stupidity of his labor. But Arthur never shouted back, never defended his architectural design, and never stopped swinging his pickaxe into the hillside. He let the mockery wash over him, offering absolutely no explanation for his actions, because he knew a fundamental truth about survival that the proud men in their drafty wooden mansions were about to learn at the cost of their own lives. A truth that would soon make the mocked Earthworm the only man capable of saving them from the freezing dark. Arthur Vance was not a madman. As his iron pickaxe struck the ancient permafrost, he wasn't blindly digging a hole. He was weaponizing the earth itself. He knew that while the Yukon winter could violently drag the surface temperature down to minus 60 degrees, just a few feet below that frozen crust, the earth maintained a remarkably stable baseline near freezing. By excavating directly into the hillside, Arthur was constructing an impenetrable thermal buffer. While his wealthy neighbors fully intended to fight the deadly cold by burning mountains of expensive wood just to heat the constantly escaping air inside their drafty cabins, Arthur swung his pickaxe, choosing to step aside and let the colossal thermal mass of the earth do the heavy lifting. But would this underground theory actually hold up when the deep freeze hit? The physical labor required to achieve this subterranean vision was nothing short of agonizing. Striking the ancient Canadian permafrost with an iron pickaxe felt exactly like trying to chop through a solid slab of granite. Every single inch of forward progress demanded a heavy, painful toll in sweat, blistered hands, and bruised muscles. For agonizing weeks, Arthur worked relentlessly from the pale, freezing dawn until the lingering twilight, slowly carving out a deep, rectangular cavity into the protective embrace of the hill. He explicitly refused to buy the massive, incredibly expensive logs that the syndicate men were flaunting on the main street. Instead, he meticulously gathered smaller, vastly cheaper timber, assembling a remarkably simple, lightweight internal framework just strong enough to safely hold back the tremendous weight of the soil. Once that modest wooden skeleton was securely locked into place, the true structural genius of his design finally took shape. He spent exhausting days hauling heavy loads of excavated dirt, loose river rocks, and enormous quantities of thick, dry tundra moss, piling these raw materials aggressively over the roof and firmly against the exposed outer walls. He packed the fibrous moss tightly into every conceivable gap, creating an incredibly dense layer of natural insulation that would fiercely trap the heat inside. He was building an impenetrable fortress, but every fortress has a weak point. How do you protect the only way in? To survive, Arthur had to neutralize the true apex predator of the Klondike, the wind, a relentless force that could easily slice through solid timber cabins by finding the microscopic gaps between stacked logs. The wind would simply flow harmlessly over his hidden, earth-packed dwelling. He engineered his entrance not as a simple doorway, but as a suffocating trap for the storm. He carved a long, distinctly curved trench into the hillside, effectively creating a deadly airlock sealed by an outer timber door and a heavy inner canvas. When the howling northern wind tried to violently blast its way inside, it couldn't shoot straight into the living space. Instead, the lethal cold violently crashed against the curved earthen walls, choking on its own momentum and dying completely before it could ever touch the inner sanctuary. It was a brilliant architectural trap, but nature is notoriously cruel at finding the fatal flaws in human engineering. As September reluctantly rolled into October and the precious daylight hours grew ominously shorter, the stark architectural divide in Dawson City became impossible to ignore. Down along the muddy main streets, Caleb Ward and his wealthy peers stood proudly before their towering wooden monuments, loudly boasting about the sheer volume of fuel they had stockpiled and the impressive size of their imported stoves. They placed their absolute, unquestioning faith in the thickness of a dead tree and the brute power of a roaring fire. Meanwhile, Arthur's isolated hillside plot looked like nothing more than a freshly covered mound of dirt and dead wild grass, barely distinguishable from the natural landscape. The crowds of idle miners and passing merchants continued to visit the site on their days off, treating the muddy mound as a premier local comedy attraction. They pointed mockingly at the small, dark entrance and laughed at the sheer absurdity of a grown man choosing to live like a scavenging rodent when there was so much gold to be spent. Their confidence in their own superior building methods was absolute. They firmly believed that survival was merely another commodity that could simply be purchased if a man had enough gold dust. Arthur ignored their pointing fingers and their cruel laughter, quietly reinforcing his iron door hinges and preparing his modest stockpile of scavenged twigs. How long would their laughter echo once the real freeze arrived? The icy trap of the northern winter was already slowly closing around the unprepared settlement, and the mocked Earthworm was the only man truly ready for the jaws to finally snap shut. November arrived not merely as a change of month on the calendar, but as a heavy iron door violently slamming shut on Dawson City. The rushing waters of the Yukon River froze solid in a matter of agonizing days, the shifting ice echoing through the valley with loud cracks that sounded exactly like heavy cannon fire. This freezing effectively cut the booming settlement off from the rest of the known world, trapping thousands of unprepared souls in a deadly isolated valley. The ambient temperature rapidly plummeted past 30 degrees below zero, and a cold, creeping dread finally began to spread through the crowded saloons and the newly built wooden mansions. The terrifying reality of the northern winter was setting in, and the price of dry firewood absolutely skyrocketed overnight. Chopped wood suddenly became vastly more precious than the heavy pouches of gold dust men carried on their belts. Down in the valley center, Caleb Ward and his wealthy peers began feeding their massive iron stoves around the clock, watching their expensive stockpiles of timber shrink with terrifying speed just to keep the creeping frost from covering their wooden floorboards. But while the wealthy were fighting a losing war above ground, was the man beneath the earth truly safe? Hidden underground on the quiet hillside, Arthur Vance was suddenly facing a terrifying crisis of his own. His thermal mass system was actually working almost too well, and it was now threatening to destroy him from the inside out. Because the interior of the dugout was so remarkably warm compared to the deeply frozen earth surrounding it, a violent clash of temperatures was constantly happening right above his head. Thick condensation began to build rapidly on the raw timber ceiling of his subterranean sanctuary. At first, it appeared as just a dark, damp patch on the wood, but within a few days, freezing water began to drip steadily onto his wool bedroll and his meager food supplies. In a hostile climate where getting wet meant almost certain death by rapid hypothermia, this hidden architectural defect was a catastrophic failure. The mocking laughter of the town-esque carpenters echoed loudly in his memory. Perhaps they had been right about the inevitable rot and the lethal dampness of the earth. Would the Earthworm's brilliant design become his own watery grave? A lesser, more panicked man would have immediately built a massive, roaring fire inside the stove to forcefully dry out the dampness. But Arthur deeply understood the delicate, unforgiving balance of thermodynamics. If he built a massive fire, the intense heat would violently thaw the surrounding permafrost, turning his solid earthen walls into a collapsing tomb of heavy mud and literally burying him alive beneath tons of wet dirt. Instead of fighting the cold with brute force, he used the invisible laws of physics to instantly rebalance the equation, Using a heated iron rod, he painstakingly punched a narrow vertical ventilation shaft straight up through the roof timbers and the frozen soil, opening it directly to the surface. Then, he meticulously packed the entire interior ceiling with a fresh, incredibly thick layer of highly absorbent, completely dry tundra moss. The narrow shaft instantly created a gentle, controlled updraft, pulling the excess heavy moisture out into the freezing night sky before it could ever condense into liquid, while the moss acted as a perfect natural sponge for any remaining dampness. Within 48 hours, the dangerous dripping stopped completely. The air inside the dugout became bone-dry and perfectly stable. The underground system was saved not by generating more heat, but by carefully controlling the invisible airflow. With the deadly crisis successfully averted, Arthur settled into a rigid routine of daily survival. He opened a small, worn leather ledger on his wooden table and began meticulously recording the daily temperature fluctuations and his precise fuel consumption. The numbers he wrote down on those pages were absolutely staggering in their implications. While the wealthy syndicate men down in the valley were burning through massive cords of split wood every single week, Arthur was burning 80% less fuel to maintain a warmer environment. He effortlessly heated his entire shelter, using only small bundles of scavenged willow branches and discarded scraps of lumber he had gathered for free during the summer. The profound, unnatural warmth of his earthen bunker did not go entirely unnoticed by the environment. One exceptionally bitter evening, a stray sled dog, abandoned by a desperate owner and left to freeze in the harsh streets, wandered up the lonely hillside. Driven by a primal instinct that the civilized humans in the valley had long forgotten, the starving animal completely bypassed the towering wooden houses that were frantically leaking heat and thick smoke. It followed the subtle, radiant warmth escaping from the earth itself and curled up tightly inside the curved entrance of Arthur's airlock trench. Arthur opened the heavy timber door, and without a single word of command, the dog stepped confidently inside, recognizing immediately that this silent mound of dirt was the only true sanctuary in a valley completely filled with freezing men. But this peaceful sanctuary was about to face a meteorological monster that would test every single inch of Arthur's design, and not everyone was going to survive it. December initiated a brutal, unrelenting siege on Dawson City. Caleb Ward, the syndicate man who had laughed the loudest at the Earthworm, was now paying the ultimate price for his architectural arrogance. He was burning through actual fortunes, trading heavy pouches of pure gold dust for half-green cords of chopped wood just to keep his massive two-story mansion from becoming a frozen tomb. He kept his massive cast-iron stove stoked until the thick metal literally glowed a dangerous cherry red, radiating a heat that blistered the skin of anyone standing right next to it. Yet, the invisible drafts ripping through the grand, poorly insulated rooms were so intensely powerful that a cup of water placed just 7 feet away from that glowing stove would freeze solid in less than an hour. His immense wealth could easily buy the fuel, but he could never truly buy the warmth. He was trapped in a beautiful, incredibly expensive icebox of his own making, watching his fortune turn to ash just to survive the night. But while the wealthy were literally burning their fortunes to stave off death, what was happening down below the frost line? Down below the frost line, hidden entirely from the frantic struggle of the valley, Arthur Vance was living in an environment of absolute, unnerving peace. The devastating wind that was currently tearing the heavy wooden roofs off the town's storage sheds could not penetrate the thick, solid armor of frozen dirt and dense moss that covered his home. Inside the dugout, there were no drafts, no glowing red stoves, and no desperate night watches required. The air was perfectly still and deeply warm. Arthur slept soundly through the darkest nights, his small sheet metal stove banked low and requiring only a tiny handful of scavenged wood every 8 hours. The heavy thermal mass of the surrounding Earth easily absorbed that meager heat and gently, continuously radiated it back into the room, creating a perfectly stable microclimate. He spent his days carving handles for his tools, mending his leather gear, and listening to the muffled, distant roar of the wind above, a sound that felt as remarkably remote as ocean waves to a man standing safely on a high cliff. The rescued sled dog slept curled at his feet, completely relaxed, its belly full of warm scraps. It seemed Arthur had truly beaten the Yukon winter, or had he simply not yet faced its final, deadliest form? But the worst of the Yukon winter had not yet arrived. In the middle of January, the subtle, invisible signs of a true historic catastrophe began to manifest in the stillness of the underground shelter. Arthur noticed it first on the glass face of his brass barometer, a delicate scientific instrument he checked with religious devotion every single morning. The black needle had plummeted downward with a sudden, violent speed that defied all normal weather patterns. It was a terrifying drop that signaled a massive, crushing change in atmospheric pressure. A few hours later, the stray dog suddenly stood up from its warm spot by the stove. The animal began to pace nervously around the small earthen room, whimpering softly in the back of its throat. It refused to eat, completely ignoring the dried meat Arthur offered from his hand. Instead, the dog squeezed itself into the darkest, most protected corner of the room, curling into a tight, trembling ball and burying its nose deeply beneath its paws. What ancient terror was the animal sensing that the brass barometer could only hint at? The animal's ancient wild instincts were screaming a dire warning that human senses could not yet detect. A Canadian polar monster was gathering its immense strength just beyond the mountains, preparing to drop directly onto the valley and execute a final, merciless judgment on everyone who had dared to challenge the North with nothing but dead wood and blind pride. Could a simple earthen dugout withstand the full apocalyptic fury of nature's ultimate weapon? The polar monster did not arrive with a gentle snowfall. It slammed into the Klondike Valley with the kinetic violence of a runaway freight train. Within a matter of hours, the ambient temperature violently crashed past -55 degrees, accompanied by a screaming hurricane-force wind that completely erased the horizon and turned the midday sky into a suffocating, blinding white void. This was not a storm a man could fight or endure. It was an apocalyptic event that instantly paralyzed the entire settlement of Dawson City. The sheer mechanical force of the wind ripped heavy wooden shingles directly off the roofs of the most expensive structures, turning them into lethal projectiles that shattered against the neighboring walls. Anyone foolish enough to step outside into the chaotic streets was instantly blinded by the driving ice, their lungs physically seizing up as the unnaturally cold air triggered an immediate, agonizing asthmatic shock. The frontier town, built on the arrogant assumption that human industry could conquer the wild North, was suddenly plunged into a desperate, chaotic fight for basic survival against an enemy that could not be reasoned with and could not be bribed. But when gold and industry mean absolutely nothing, what exactly is left to save you? Down on the main street, the ultimate symbol of Klondike wealth was failing in spectacular, terrifying fashion. Caleb Ward stood inside his massive 2-story timber mansion, wrapped in heavy layers of expensive furs, watching his architectural masterpiece slowly transform into a freezing death trap. The intense thermal stress between the roaring cast-iron stove inside and the apocalyptic cold outside was simply too much for the materials to bear. With a sharp, explosive crack that sounded exactly like a pistol shot, the thick glass panes of his large, expensive windows began to fracture, letting the lethal wind slice directly into the grand living room. Would the freezing temperatures claim them first, or would the house itself deliver the final blow? But the broken glass was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The massive stone chimney, built high to impress the neighbors, suddenly became a fatal liability. The hurricane winds tearing across the roof created a violent aerodynamic pressure zone, effectively plugging the chimney and creating a massive backdraft. In a matter of seconds, thick, choking, acrid smoke poured out of the stove and rapidly filled the large room, violently displacing the breathable air. Ward and his master carpenter, Silas Gibbs, dropped to their hands and knees, coughing violently, their eyes burning from the toxic fumes. They were forced to make an impossible, agonizing choice: open the broken windows further to clear the suffocating smoke and instantly freeze to death, or keep the room sealed and die of asphyxiation. How do you choose between freezing to death in a shattered icebox or suffocating on the smoke of your own ruined fortune? They huddled desperately on the floor, shivering uncontrollably right next to a heavy leather pouch filled with raw gold dust that was now entirely, utterly worthless. Their mountain of expensive firewood was rapidly dwindling, and the massive house was aggressively killing them. Could salvation possibly exist anywhere in this frozen hellscape? Less than 2 miles away, buried deep within the rocky hillside, the exact same storm was raging, but the physical reality could not have been more completely different. The apocalyptic wind that was currently tearing Dawson City apart struck the earthen mound of Arthur Vance's dugout and simply slid right over the top of it. The dense layer of frozen dirt and thick tundra moss offered absolutely no resistance, seamlessly blending into the natural aerodynamics of the hill. Down inside the subterranean sanctuary, the terrifying roar of the polar hurricane was muffled into a distant, gentle hum, sounding more like a muted waterfall than a deadly blizzard. Arthur sat calmly at his small wooden table, entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding above his head. He had not added a single extra piece of wood to his small sheet metal stove. He simply did not need to. The ambient temperature inside the dugout remained perfectly, unnaturally stable, radiating a gentle, consistent warmth that had been securely banked within the thermal mass of the earth for months. A small glass thermometer, hanging on a wooden peg beside him, displayed a comfortable 60 degrees above zero, an absolute physical impossibility to anyone currently fighting for their lives in the valley below. Arthur carefully turned the page of a worn book by the steady, unflickering light of an oil lamp, while the rescued sled dog snored softly at his feet, completely oblivious to the fact that the deadliest winter in the history of the gold rush was violently raging just a few feet beyond their solid earthen walls. The storm had come to execute its final judgment on human pride, and the mocked Earthworm was the only man sitting in the judge's blind spot. But as the death toll in the valley began to rise, would the proud men finally swallow their pride and seek out the Earthworm before it was too late? By the dawn of the 3rd consecutive day of the relentless polar storm, the grand illusion of wealth and superiority in the valley finally collapsed completely. Inside the freezing ruins of his 2-story timber mansion, Caleb Ward was losing the battle for his life. His massive, expensive stockpile of split firewood had been completely consumed, burned away in a futile, desperate attempt to fight an ocean of cold with a single bucket of heat. The heavy cast iron stove, which had glowed a dangerous red just 48 hours earlier, was now nothing more than a block of dead, freezing metal. The interior walls of the grand living room were entirely coated in a thick, glittering layer of white frost, and the temperature inside the house was rapidly equalizing with the deadly -55 degrees howling just outside the shattered windows. Ward and his master carpenter, Silas Gibbs, were huddled miserably together beneath a pile of stiff, freezing furs, their bodies violently shaking as profound hypothermia began to shut down their vital organs. The heavy leather pouches of pure gold dust, the very reason they had risked their lives to travel to the Klondike, lay completely forgotten and utterly useless on the icy floorboards. You cannot negotiate with a blizzard, and you cannot burn gold for warmth. Faced with the absolute certainty of freezing to death within the next few hours, Ward made a desperate, agonizing decision. They had to abandon the mansion. They had to plunge directly into the blinding white chaos of the hurricane and try to reach the only place on the entire settlement that might still hold a spark of life. They had to crawl toward the hillside they had spent the entire autumn mocking. But could two dying men survive a 2-mile march through an apocalyptic whiteout? The agonizing journey across the 2 miles of frozen, wind-blasted valley was a terrifying descent into physical hell. The hurricane winds battered them mercilessly, knocking the two freezing men to their hands and knees over and over again. The driving ice instantly froze their eyelashes shut, blinding them completely in the white void, while the unnaturally cold air felt like swallowing broken glass with every single ragged breath. They navigated purely by desperate instinct, fighting against the overwhelming, seductive urge to simply lie down in the soft snow and go to sleep. When they finally stumbled blindly onto the steep incline of the rocky hillside, they could not even see the dugout. The earthen structure was entirely buried beneath massive snowdrifts, blending perfectly into the white landscape. The only microscopic sign of human existence was a faint, almost invisible wisp of gray smoke fighting its way out of the vertical ventilation shaft, instantly snatched away and shredded by the violent gale. Falling forward into the snow, Ward's numb, frost-bitten hands accidentally struck the solid, frozen timber of the outer airlock door. With the absolute last remnants of his fading strength, the wealthy syndicate man began to pound desperately on the heavy wood, screaming for salvation into a wind that completely swallowed his voice. If the howling storm ate his final screams, would the mocked earthworm even hear them? Deep inside the silent, perfectly stable thermal sanctuary, Arthur Vance heard the faint, muffled thumping echoing down his curved entrance trench. He calmly set his book down on the wooden table, picked up his oil lamp, and walked slowly toward the airlock. When he unlatched and pulled open the heavy outer door, the two half-dead men collapsed forward into the narrow corridor in a tangled mass of frozen furs and ice. Arthur did not hesitate, and he certainly did not ask questions. He grabbed them by their heavy coats and dragged them roughly into the curved trench, immediately slamming the thick outer door shut behind them to instantly cut off the lethal, howling wind. As he pulled them through the secondary canvas door and into the main subterranean living space, the sheer physical shock of the environment hit the two freezing men with the force of a physical blow. They collapsed weakly onto the dry, packed dirt floor, gasping for air, their frozen minds completely unable to comprehend the impossible reality of what they were experiencing. There was no massive, roaring fire to scorch their faces. There were no towering stacks of expensive timber. There was only a profound, unnatural silence and a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to radiate from the very walls themselves. The small glass thermometer hanging nearby stood proudly at 60 degrees, mocking the absolute destruction raging in the valley below. Ward, trembling violently as his frozen blood slowly began to circulate again, stared in absolute disbelief at the tiny sheet metal stove. Arthur was feeding it with nothing more than a handful of dry, scavenged willow twigs, yet the room felt like a warm summer evening. In the corner, the abandoned stray dog lifted its head lazily, blinked at the intruders, and went comfortably back to sleep on the dry moss. As the agonizing pain of thawing flesh began to wash over his frost-bitten hands and face, Caleb Ward looked up at the man he had publicly humiliated for months. The syndicate man's immense pride had been entirely stripped away by the storm, leaving behind only the raw, humbling realization of his own foolishness. Tears of physical pain and profound relief cut clean tracks through the dark soot and white frost on his face. He finally understood that his expensive wooden mansion had been a monument to human arrogance, while this simple, dirty hole in the ground was a masterpiece of survival. Arthur did not gloat. He did not utter a single word of triumph or demand an apology for the months of cruel laughter. He simply poured 2 tin cups of hot water from the kettle resting on the stove and handed them to the shivering men. His complete, unbroken silence was the most devastating and absolute victory possible. The Earth had proven its supreme power. The physics of thermal mass had worked exactly as engineered, and the mocked Earthworm had effortlessly become the unquestioned savior of the men who had wished him dead. But what would happen when the storm finally broke, and the survivors were forced to look upon the frozen graveyard their arrogance had built? The brutal polar monster eventually exhausted its terrifying rage, releasing its suffocating grip on the Klondike Valley as the slow, hesitant spring of 1898 finally arrived. As the massive snowdrifts began to recede, the melting ice slowly exposed the catastrophic, undeniable reality of what the unprecedented winter had done to Dawson City. The great thaw revealed a devastating landscape of shattered dreams and fatal human arrogance. Dozens of expensive, heavy timber mansions stood completely abandoned along the muddy main street, their interiors destroyed by the violent temperature extremes and the frantic, desperate fires of their freezing inhabitants. The frozen graveyard on the edge of the settlement had expanded drastically, filled with the bodies of proud men who genuinely believed they could conquer the absolute worst of the Arctic weather with heavy pouches of gold dust and the sheer thickness of dead logs. They had waged a direct, frontal war against the savage northern climate, and the climate had effortlessly destroyed them. But high up on the rocky hillside, the humble mound of dirt and dry tundra moss remained absolutely unchanged, emerging from the melting snow exactly as it had been built. It had not merely survived the apocalypse, it had comfortably ignored it. Caleb Ward and Silas Gibbs eventually walked out of that subterranean sanctuary alive, but they were fundamentally, irrevocably changed men. The immense wealth and high social status that Ward possessed meant absolutely nothing compared to the profound, shattering humiliation he had experienced while lying on the packed dirt floor of Arthur Vance's dugout. His towering wooden mansion, the ultimate symbol of his Klondike success, was completely ruined, permanently stained with heavy soot and scarred by the violent backdrafts of the desperate winter. How does a master carpenter finally admit that the man he called a scavenging rodent had beaten him at his own game? Silas Gibbs, the proud master carpenter who had spent the entire autumn standing by the wagon ruts and openly mocking the man he called the Earthworm, now approached Arthur with a radically different demeanor. He arrived not with cruel jokes or loud proclamations of superior building techniques, but with a worn leather notebook in his frost-bitten hands and a completely shattered ego.